Welcome back as we continue our course on critical race theory. This week, we will be doing our fourth session of Volume 4, Intro into Critical Race Theory. Just a quick recap on where we left off at. We covered what is a theory, how are theories used, and more importantly, what are the fundamental tenets of critical race theory to dispel some of the challenges for understanding and why people find it so hard to understand some of the concepts and tenets, because it affects their worldview, how they see the world. And in America specifically, we are not trained to see the world outside of what we are perceiving. And so as we go forward, we're going to talk about some practices that have been called critical race theory, but what they are attempts to use the theory to create practical applications for other people. For example, me teaching this course is practice. It's a praxis. I am able to teach this course because I am free. I am under no obligation. I am under no duress. And I'm sharing this with you all for your understanding and hopefully your enlightenment. Now, as a free person, if I worked at a university or if I worked at an organization that restricted what message they wanted to send, then I could not create a praxis because I would be under their discretion of what they wanted me to practice. And so often when it comes to theory, practicing something can be very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Because if you don't know what you're doing, you could be injured or others could be injured by the things that you are doing. And, we have a lot of examples throughout history where people have tried to practice things that were detrimental in the long run, but they were doing it because they wanted to understand a phenomenon. Recently I was watching a show. It was an older show. It was like a highlights where they were having people come on to the show to expose their secret crushes. And one of the guys came on there. His secret crush was a guy. But no one thought that maybe bringing a guy on stage to tell another guy he had a secret crush on him could be a problem. Now, this was back in the early 90s. So you see that there was a time frame where, culturally we have shifted. But had somebody did the questioning and asked those questions about, did somebody feel comfortable with that, it could have alleviated the individual who said that he liked the individual getting murdered by the individual who was brought on TV from out of shame. Because praxis lets us know that we have to be ethical when we are doing practices. We have to be ethical, because if we're not ethical, then our practice cannot be reproduced because they will do more harm than good. Now, when it comes to critical race theory, often what I'm hearing is that children are being taught it. Now, when we understand why that accusation is so damning, is because we understand that when Socrates was killed in Athens, one of his charges was corrupting the minds of the youth of the children of Athens. So anytime we teach something to our children, specifically to children as a whole, we have to be very careful, because it is in the children that we see the changes of a nation. Because the idea that revolution is born in the mind of a child. It's the mind of a child where revolution is born. And if you can keep ideas away from children, then that would be the primal breeding ground for any dissent. So what has happened is that people have tried to conflate critical race theory as some means of indoctrinating children. And that is not what it is. If you look at pedagogy or how to teach, the art of teaching and the priorities of teaching, what we've seen in America is two separate phenomena intersecting as one. It's, I am told one thing, but I am shown something else. I'll say that one more time. I am told one thing, but I am shown something else. Now, in order to reconcile being told one thing and shown something else, I need an explanation. I need a theory to explain the phenomenon of why I'm hearing one thing and being shown something else. For example, we will say that there is equality and justice for all in America. But then when we look through American history and we hear our stories of lynchings, of judicial misconduct, how laws have been used in a very systemic way to suppress people, then we have a difference of, well, wait a minute, why can I reconcile these two phenomena? Because when we start to understand praxis and practice, we have to make sure that the practice can be tested. Now, how do you test something? Usually you need people to volunteer. You need people to consent. You need people to be aware that they're being tested, that they're being experimented, that they're trying to learn something new. This will give them the peace of mind that they are willing participants, that they're not being coerced or manipulated. As in, I'm forcing no one to watch this course. If you're watching this course, it's because you chose to want to be here to hear more about critical race theory from a person who you think is qualified to tell you about the theory. Now, if you don't think that that is the case, then you can now click off. You can do whatever you want to do to find other information or sources. But what has happened is we've created an environment where if I don't like something you're saying, if I don't like your theory, I don't have to propose an alternative to you. Okay, so let's use an example in America about how this has happened. When we see police misconduct, or we see information that gets out that we know that is not right, when we hear people say stuff, well, if they would have just done this, they would have been okay. These are arguments to explain why there is a difference. Well, they were a criminal. Like that somehow gives the police the ability to summarily execute you on the middle of the street. Because we know that there are a lot of people who are criminals in this country who are not summarily executed on the street. We can see it all the time. We can look at just recently, a bank was charged for laundering drug money, and they paid the largest fine in U.S. history. But we understand that no one went to jail because they can just use the profits from the drug enterprise to pay the fine. But if somebody's on the corner with a $5 bag of whatever, they might spend 5 to 10 years in jail. And we understand that that's not the issue of fairness, but the issue is somebody has to explain to me why there's consequences for this and not consequences for that. Now, what happens with theory sometimes is we get to this misconception of premise, meaning theory exists to explain the phenomenon. So going back to policing in America, when people tell me that policing is broken, I reject the idea. I tell them that no, policing isn't broken. It operates how it was intended to function and perform. It does what it's supposed to do. And because it does what it's supposed to do, we have to remember that while it's doing what it's supposed to do, we have to be cognizant that it is only allowed to practice it because people have been under the impression that it is doing or it is broken in some way. But if it is not broken, if it's doing what it's supposed to do, then we will change our framework to address it. And how we train our framework to address it is we have to acknowledge that it is working for people who it was intended to work for. Now, when something is working for someone it was intended to work for and not working for others, what we have is what's called a dual consciousness. We have two realities in one. And when we have to reconcile that, usually it does not fall on the people who have the understanding that it is working correctly because they are the majority. They are the ones who are benefiting from the practices. So they have no interest to understand another perspective, meaning they could try to understand the perspective, but in order to do so, it would challenge or change their worldview and create what's called cognitive dissonance. And when we talk about practice or praxis, we have to know that we are explaining a phenomenon from a perspective of people who were never supposed to. And critical ideas and critical thinking allow us to see and examine something that was beyond the threshold of people to see. So as we're understanding now more, so when you get a better understanding of something, then you can explain it to someone easier. And that becomes the goal of education. It's not how well can I teach something, it's how quickly can I teach it, how measurably can I teach it, and how can it be reproduced in the mind of the student. Because if we go into the idea that it is the teacher's responsibility to explain to the student why is the lesson so important, because when you build something, you must first know why you are building it. And we see people today that are well intended. It would go into Hanslow's law, which says that you should never attribute malice initially. You should attribute it to ignorance. If someone if you're not understanding somebody, or somebody you think they're trying to do something to harm you, he says attribute it not to malice. Now, when I say malice, I think of it as someone who is intentionally trying to harm you. And I think because people lack a good understanding of what critical race theory is, they are in good faith, I believe, trying to explain or say something that is not necessarily the truth. One of those examples would be critical race theory is just telling us history. In practice, telling us history is a part of the story, but it is not the theory. And it is a component of an understanding. So one way to put that will be the 1619 Project. If you understand the 1619 Project, it was designed to allow Black voices and Black contributions to America to be highlighted in a country where they were not highlighted, where they were put to the back burner. It said, hey, look, we had a fundamental role in shaping and forming this country from both sides of the perspective. And we want that to be acknowledged. We want that to be taught to our kids. Now, is teaching that to children critical race theory? No, that is not. Teaching the history and the Black contributions of this country, good and bad, or from both sides, it's not a bad thing. Now, when it comes to age appropriate education, or how old should someone be before they learn history? And if we teach something too soon to someone, will it create or jade their worldview or perspective? Now, these are all legitimate concerns. Children's minds are sponges, and they are easily susceptible to information because they lack critical thinking resources and faculties. The frontal cortex of the brain is not even developed until the mid-20s. So from a practices perspective, if we don't tell people things, they will find them out on their own. Let me say that one more time. If we don't tell or share things with people, they will find the information out on their own. And how will they find that information out? They will find that information out by seeking it, because they're going to be looking for things and explanations that you're not telling them. If every day it rains and you say, you need an umbrella tomorrow, I'm not going to believe you. You will have no credibility with me, because I understand that the trends that we are talking about are harder to understand when people don't know themselves. Like, we are always talking about, well, who is going to teach the kids about critical race theory? And I'm like, teach the kids? Who going to teach the parents? Because the parents need just as much education as the kids. And one of the fears in the parents is that the kids are going to be more educated in this country about them. And that creates a problem in a hierarchical society where we have this idea that we cannot learn from children. Because I think that it will be the children who essentially create environments to create conversations that are hard to have about race, about sex, about politics, about religion, about war, about the nature of economies. But the question then becomes is what tools are we giving the future generations? What tools are we giving them to solve their problems? And I would submit to you all today that the tools that we are providing to our children are insufficient. Critical race theory is a tool. It is a tool, not the only tool, but it is a tool to help kids understand. Now, when I would say kids, I make the distinction between pre-adolescent children. Discretionary education is always important, but if it's public education, then I think that it becomes incumbent upon the society to educate us all. But when you're talking about sensitive subjects that can cause division, I've heard the argument that we don't want to teach things that make children uncomfortable. Now, I think about that idea and I'd say, well, that's not education. Education will make you uncomfortable. Education will challenge you. It will push your worldview and your beliefs. It will ultimately have you reevaluating or reassessing things that you were long core beliefs. You know, things that your mom told you when you were like 6 that you found out that mama didn't know what she was talking about. And not saying that mama didn't mean well. She just wasn't educated or informed. And there's nothing wrong with not being educated and informed. There are many things that we are not educated and informed on that we continue to have progress on because we have made in our minds that we are not content with not knowing. And then when we decide to not be content with not knowing, then we will take the onus upon ourselves to educate us. That we will not look for a teacher. We will look for our own faculty. And that becomes the guide for many of us. So on to the praxis. Where are the rubber meets the road? Theory explains something. Practice does something about it. It does something. Now, because critical theory and critical legal studies are the basis for critical race theory, in praxis, critical race theory works best in legal settings. It works best in arguments. It works best in debates, in dialectic, back and forth, and in the Socratic way of speaking to people. To not know something becomes a way to gain understanding. I need to know your story because if I know your story, then what I can do is I can quantify it. And then once I quantify it, I can speak on behalf of the population until I get discrepant data, meaning one off or two off information. When I talk to people specifically about issues of race, one thing that I do is I like to not initiate any conversations about race with anyone personally as a strategy. I don't want to have a conversation about something that someone does not want to speak about first. Now, but does that mean that I won't talk about race with that person? No, not at all. But there are times when people will say things to me that I find is a teachable moment. Now, you have to be careful with teachable moments because most people I find don't like unsolicited information. If they're not asking you for your opinion or your advice, for you to provide it can come off as superfluous, grandiose, or like you have some kind of agenda. What with critical race theory is not important to have an agenda is because we have an explanation for when the others do not. And when you have an explanation for when others do not, people will seek your opinion and seek your advice, and you don't have to go out and solicit it or sell it to anybody. When they start to ban critical race theory, people are going to go online and type in critical race theory, and this video will pop up, and then they'll see me and they'll be like, wait a minute, what is he saying? Okay. Because the seeking happens naturally when you see a counterbalancing force. Now, on the flip side, praxis works by counter storytelling, meaning I have to prevent you from telling your story to others. This is how I keep my power. So in praxis, I'm going to ban social medias. I'm going to ban TikTok, I'm going to ban books. I'm going to ban. This is in practice. In practice, I will do these things, or the powers that be, the government, authorities, parents of concerned students will write letters to school board counselors saying, I don't want my kids being radicalized at your school. See, in praxis, this is what you do when you feel that there is a threat. You make defensive measures, and you go as far as to say, I'm going to pull my children out of that school system if I have the luxury. That's in praxis. As a counterweight to that praxis, it's nothing new under the sun. The ideas are as old as time. It was Victor Hugo said that there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And see, in America, the time has come because we have been window dressing the issue. We have been putting band-aids on bullet wounds, and we have not addressed the issues. So in praxis, what you have seen is legislation. You have seen legislation passed. When you go back into American history, you have some cases, you have Supreme Court decisions, you have Civil Rights Acts, you have Voting Rights Act. So in praxis, these would be critical understanding how we gotten to where we're at today. Because in practice, if you don't know how you got to where you're at currently, then you won't understand how to converge the interests to go further, or the intersectionality to go where you need to go. So in practice, there are Black people who are now aligning themselves primarily with the Republican Party. Now, not the majority. It's a small percentage, maybe 15, 20% currently, because they becoming dissatisfied. And one of the things you do in practice when you become dissatisfied is you look for alternatives. And that's what critical race theory became. It became an alternative to all of the foolishness that was being told to Black people about our progresses here. The issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion is ultimately a practice, is that we understand that if we allow races the ability to discriminate, they will discriminate. I don't know why I had to say it one more time. If we allow races the ability to discriminate, they will discriminate. And they will do it to the detriment of us all. Because, there was a refrain in practice. It starts off with a declaration. It starts off with a line that is drawn that you say you will not cross. In legalese, there's this term called stare decisis. It means we are bound by the previous order or the previous decision of a court. And as we see that these courts in America are not bound by anything anymore. So in practice, what they are doing is making up stuff as they go. They're just making it up. And they don't know what it's going to lead to. It was very telling on January 6th. I listened to the speech that was given to the crowd, and I looked at it in the lens of Brandenburg v. Ohio. And Brandenburg v. Ohio was the current, I say was the current because I don't know what it is now. It was the current standard for when speech crossed the threshold of being free into being seditious, insurrectionist. And one of those provisions is a two-pronged test. In practice, there's two things you have to do. Is that you have to essentially advocate violence, and then the people who you're talking to go out there and then they act upon what you told them to do. And it's a direct correlation. It's an immediacy to it, meaning like if people are being riled up or revved up about something and you have no way to do anything about it, it becomes what's called stochastic terrorism. And stochastic terrorism, like I said, something you can look up, but stochastic terrorism is a way, a practice to keep things in place, because you need to be able to have plausible deniability from any of the actions that you do, but at the same time have enough legal cover to make sure that you are in that gray area, not crossover. And it's a skill that most people don't have because they don't trust in the now to be able to say things to people that can radicalize them, because people are not radicalized overnight. People are radicalized slowly and gradually. It's gradualism that that leads up to a punctuated equilibrium event, which means to gradually and then boom, something happens that removes or shakes it. Same thing happened when George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin. It was a punctuated event, because what we see happen is that the moment that it was realized that these individuals were going to go home and sleep, it created a problem cognitively, because most people in America didn't think that that could have been them. And so often when we see videos of police misconduct, most notably the Rodney King video in '92, when we see these videos, we are reminded that I could be next. And there is an objective reasonableness in practice of things that I will do to protect myself. And when you start to talk about these issues, then you have to understand the practice that was used in this country to keep the status quo racially. The first one, or one of the first ones, was after the Civil War had ended. Southern states had initiated what we call black codes. And some of the first black codes prohibited newly freed or emancipated, it's a difference, newly emancipated slaves could not own firearms. And one of the reasons that this was the case is because there was a fear in the white population that the enslaved individuals would want some type of vengeance or some type of retribution for past transgressions. This never materialized, but the concern is still here today. And when you start to talk to people about, laws, the 1968 Omnibus Crime Bill, or the Controlled Substances Act '68, where, the last major gun legislation happened. When we are talking about, restricting access, it was the Black Panther Party who went into the Capitol with weapons that changed the law in California, and the National Rifle Association backed the bill, the Mulford Act, and I think that when you start to look at our history in this country that we just seen last year, there was a whole group of white militia who went into a couple years ago during COVID, who went into the state capitals and were demanding justice with rifles and everything. But we saw no legislation passed. Now, I'm going to let you speculate on why that happened, but critical race theory doesn't need to speculate, because there is an interest conversion with people who are African descent not having firearms around people in areas with power. That's what it is. Debate it all you want, but that's the fact. And so when you start to talk about what has happened in our country and the practices that we have created internally to keep our system in place, when you challenge one of these systems and when you challenge one of these practices, you will be met with indignation. You will be met with contempt. Someone said, to challenge, racism is so ingrained in America. To challenge racism is to challenge America itself. And on that premise, we are careful, especially as educators, as how to push the practice, because we understand that if you push too far, then they push back. And when I say they, I mean the system. And it's not necessarily about black or white. It's not about the systems are being led by black or white people, because you can have in a systemically racist society, you can have the same negative results no matter who is in power, whether it's a black person or a white person, because the system produces what the system was designed to produce, which was dispirited outcomes. Now, when white scholars get into critical race theory, which notably there are many, Beverly D'Angelo, Tim Wise, Jane Elliott, many others, like I said, throughout the social media. Social media platforms have definitely amplified the voices of a lot of anti-racist ideas. One of the people I look to, Dr. Kendi, his idea in practice was he is more educationally focused and did write a book, Stand for Children, or explaining in race neutral terms how to be anti-racist children. These are things that need to be created, because when we understand the need for these things, then there is a creation of people who have to put their imagination towards it. And the things that I tell my children or my child that I have, when I'm talking to them about racism in America, I want them to understand that this isn't, all white people are evil, or that everything that happened in this country was bad. It's just a realization of how we got to where we're at, and knowing that we have made progress, because some of the practices were painful. Some of them required water hoses on people, and dogs being set on people, and federal troops being sent in, and kids being tortured and beaten and lynched. And the idea in America that history doesn't matter tends to only come into play when you're talking about the history of the Black experience in this country. Could you imagine going to some person of Jewish ancestry and saying, we're not interested in that history that you guys have? No, because they understand that that's why Schindler's List is created, because they want people to be reminded of the things that happened to them. Because so often in practice, when you go to a hospital with an injury or with a health condition, one of the first questions the doctor asks you is there a history of this in your family? Is there a history of this? And as we are learning more about epigenetics, as about intergenerational trauma, as we learn more about these things, post-traumatic slave syndrome, in practice, people are creating things to connect the theory to something you can do with it. And first and foremost is to educate yourself. And any time you practice something, when they wanted to, I think it was the one who experimented on the Black women during the slave period with no anesthesia, the father of modern gynecology, he would practice on enslaved women, thinking that they had a higher pain tolerance and that he did not have to use anesthetic on them. And it was torture. And he tortured them for the purpose of practice. A lot of the behavioral psychology stuff of B.F. Skinner, he used to practice on his children. And we would say today it would be unethical to practice things on your children, but this is the proving ground. When you believe something strongly and you can't practice with anyone else, you use yourself as a test subject. You use yourself as a litmus test to say, did I or did I not meet the standard of, is it ready for showtime? Because when you look at books, they're filled of people in their own practices. Your practices, however, will be different. It doesn't have to look like anybody else's, because when you start to understand that the goal is not to be perfect in your practice, but the goal is to see, okay, how can I, before I take this to scale, what measures can I put in place? Some of this is peer reviewed. The things that I share with this course, I've learned from somewhere. I've learned from reading. I've learned from talking to people. I've learned from experiences of life. But then I've ultimately learned that one of the goals of education is indoctrination. It is to indoctrinate you into thinking a certain way, having a certain perspective. And when you have a perspective, your practice tends to follow that. So as a strategy of power, what has been happening is local school board elections have been contentious because the agenda starts at the school board. It starts at the place where we're talking about policy. And if your goal is to say, we don't want any children to be uncomfortable in the classroom environment, or we feel that teaching this might create enmity, hatred, or division among Black people and white people, then I would only submit to you that it already exists. It already exists. There's already division between Black and white people in this country. There's already division because we don't see the world the same, nor do we have to. But to not acknowledge that we see the world differently is disingenuous. But because we don't have to see it the same way, we will create different practices. So, how a white parent or parents teach their children about racism in America, however they choose to do it, is their practice. It's their practice. They might want some tips or some advice, but it's their practice. They have to implement it. And when we're implementing a practice or a practice of anything, we have to understand that it might not go well. It might not produce what we thought it would produce. So, for example, I understand that if I am talking to white people or whiteness, I like to, in practice, not refer to them as white in practice, because it can make them get defensive. It can get confrontational. If I said people of European ancestry, sometimes it comes off as they're not talking about me specifically, because there's a wealth in history of white people in America who were very helpful for the freedoms of Black people here. And to not acknowledge them, I mean, similar among them would be John Brown. We don't talk about John Brown because we name schools after people who killed people, like Robert E. Lee. And we talk about, in practice, when a country names something after someone, it's saying that individual had the virtues or values that we want to perpetuate to further generations. This is why you hear Frederick Douglass, but don't know Martin Delany. This is why we are focusing on the Booker T, but not Du Bois. This is why you hear, Phyllis Wheatley, but don't know Mary Childs. Because power allows me to, according to the definition of Dr. Wade Nobles, to control the reality. And in practice, anyone who can control reality or things, of pertaining to things, will have an advantage on creating practices because they will be held accountable to no one if it fails. Whereas if you are countering a narrative, anything you say will be picked apart. Any way you say it, how you say it, your gestures, your hand movements, your dress, your apparel, anything will be used to discredit you. Your fallacies will be used. You will be called biased. You will be called a distorter. You'll be a manipulator. You will be uneducated. The fact that you have a doctorate and 2 master's degrees and an English degree, and you had experience talking in race and all these credentials, because one of the things that in practice that people want to do is create a standard or qualification that they do not meet, but then can suppose on others. And I find that to be very interesting conceptually as a culture, primarily when talking about Black people in America. Because for some reason, one of the enduring practices of racism is it has empowered people, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, doesn't matter, wherever you're from, Martian, to speak on behalf of 40 million people who they don't know, as if they are some kind of expert in us or on us. And this plagues me. But if you do the exact same thing and you pathologize any other group, they're going to come together with solidarity. And you see this so often. But what has always amazed me is that this type of thinking, this paternalism, is not called out in real time. And in practice, we must start doing that. When we make broad generalizations against a group of people who we know very little about, we should be cautious, because it is a sign in practice of our internalizing the racism or its system to project in itself. And this is the reason specifically why they don't, well, I'm gonna say they, this is specifically why the powers that be, the government, governors, presidents, senators, whoever it is, I know they always seems nebulous to me. We're being precise with our language, very precise, because so oftentimes we're not trying to understand people because we don't have a need to. I don't need to know your experience. I don't need to understand you. But in practice, understanding you helps me. Because when I'm talking to groups of people, when I'm talking to anyone, I have to understand that they all don't see the world how I see it, nor do they need to. But when we begin to share ideas in practice, I can now take why you don't understand and add it to my understanding. Because when I know the reason that most don't understand the issues of race in America is because in order to keep people divided, I have to keep them ignorant. It's a part of the process. And ignorant of your understanding of the world becomes the biggest barrier to overcome. Because whether or not we can see things the same way, you need a sounding board for your practice. You need someone to help you see things differently. Because if you're the only one who sees the world how you see it, then by default, you are delusional. And if in order to share, even if you disagree with somebody, once your thoughts leave your mind, you have down created practice or praxis. And it's that leaving of the mind, it's that new idea that enters into your mind that is that seed. And like all seeds, they need to be cultivated and nourished. But as soon as the seed is planted, trust and believe, you're going to get differences of opinion. You're going to get, I like to call them specious, false arguments, disingenuous arguments from people who are not interested in learning. They're only interested in preserving their worldview. And that is not a practice that I am in concern with. If my worldview needs to be destroyed because it is not solid, then destroy it. If the truth can destroy my worldview, then it needs to be blown up. But I understand how this world works. It's about power. And the people who have been trying to create arguments in practice with morality, we learned this by watching this last election. When I saw what happened on January 6th, and I saw how people voted. So January 6th was one thing, but then I saw how people voted, knowing what's coming. It made me pause and say, let me sit back a little bit. Let me understand more, because I was confused. And when I am confused, the first thing I do is look for a theory. I look for theory to explain the phenomenon. I say, wait a minute, is America more sexist than it is racist? I say, yes, it's more sexist, because I say, well, Hillary lost to a black man. She's a woman. Trump beat a black woman, but he's a felon, insurrectionist, et cetera, sexual, whatever. But then I thought to myself, we have to understand that when we're talking to people, how to bridge those gaps. And that's what practice is. So if you're doing practice, you should be building and bridging gaps in our discussion. So that's our lesson for today. We got 2 more to go to finish this out. Looking forward to continuing our discussion in critical race theory and how we're moving forward from practice to actually understanding. Have a good day.